Good morning, and again a welcome to everybody. Let me start by saying that our panel has been a little bit reshuffled over the last 24 or 48 hours. We've of course had the pleasure of listening to Sarah, but she's been replaced in person here by Caleb Kay from the South African Institute for International Affairs. And our Chinese colleague hasn't been able to come, and she's been replaced by Ms. Hongqiu Liu. She is a journalist with a background in particularly in environmental issues. As Sarah was saying, the BRICS are in a unique position this year. We seemed to be at a sweet spot in global terms by virtue of the presidencies of G20 and an ability, at least theoretically, to influence the global agenda. There are challenges. One of the principal challenges, I think, is we wanted to be an organization focused on geoeconomics, but geopolitics keeps intruding into geoeconomics. And I think the challenge of keeping them apart, or at least not allowing one to derail the other, is a constant. We've seen this over the last couple of days in the G20 foreign ministers meetings that Delhi has hosted, where our efforts, India's efforts, and certainly those of other countries to keep the attention focused on some of the more pressing global challenges of climate change, of debt, of food security, were imposed upon by Ukraine and much else. So how do we go forth and stick to our longer-term plan without being sidetracked? And is this something that the think tanks, which hopefully are less vulnerable to the shifting sands of geopolitics, are we in a position to stick to our goals? So let me start off with that question, maybe with Renato, to get your initial comments.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. My reading of the BRICS has to do with the very fact that this is a group meant and created for influencing the global governance, whatever that means. Now, if we take a look at the summit declarations since Ekaterinburg over time, the very model of pro-tempore presidency leads you to each country that holds the presidency to adds up a new issue, a new dimension. And if you do this exercise and look at the declarations over time, you're going to see that the number of articles increase exponentially. And hence, the actual objective of influencing global governance becomes more blurred when you read the summit declarations. And that, to my view, affects the very way that the 5 countries identify themselves as a group being able to influence the international scenario. So we have, of course, a number of good stories. Sarah has mentioned the pandemic issue, you name it, the NDB, the CRA. There are a few success stories, but it's not quite clear 20 years after how strong the BRICS are to actually influence global governance, and if at all, how. It's definitely, to my view at least, not clear the way the group wants to be active in influencing global governance, even because I think that it's not homogeneous within the group what exactly has to be changed in the international environment, norms, and regulations. So I think it is a learning process, but maybe due to the time passed and the experience that we have achieved so far, it might be expected that we, at this stage, would have more clear idea of how to do it. And I have my doubts about that. Let me add a pinch of salt to our debate.
Sure, because given the very real differences between some of the largest members, is it a realistic expectation, Renato, that those differences are going to be buried just so that we can forge a common agenda when those differences can be so profound?
I think so. Why? It's not clear to what extent all the 5 countries agree in exactly what are the issues that have to be changed in international norms. The discomfort with the quote-unquote Western system has been mentioned for quite some time now. But then, having said that, it's not quite clear to what extent, what exactly we mean by that, to start with, 1. 2, to what extent all the 5 countries agree in every single point that should be changed at all. So I think there are nuances, there are clear differences among the 5 countries to try and define exactly what is where effort should be put in terms of changing the international scenario, exactly which aspects are to be changed.
Victoria, you and Renato are the veterans of the BRICS think tanks process. So I thought, let me come to you so that we can at least have the benefit of your experience and wisdom as we embark on this conversation. Any thoughts to start with?
Thank you, Sandeep. First of all, of course, it's my greatest pleasure to be speaking here. We've been, first of all, Raisina has always been a great event, and Samir Saran not only was always kind to organize a huge Raisina Dialogue, but also several times we've had, as Renato would confirm, BTTC meetings on the sidelines of Raisina, so he's always assisted with moving their BRICS case ahead. So what is important? There are a number of issues that were raised already, and in fact, many positive issues about BRICS already spoken out. What I would like to stress upon a few things. First of all, of course, as you all mentioned, BRICS started out, or was meant to start out initially as an primarily economic bloc. And by all means, what is held up till now is that BRICS is not against anybody. BRICS is a union of those countries, of course, having their divergences, but thinking alike in major issues that are geared towards global governance, international fairness, multilateralism, etc. And this is very important because if you look at their, actually at the history of how BRICS was interpreted, it was predicted that it would die next year since its outset. So first when they met on the sidelines, the foreign ministers met on the sidelines of UN in 2006 until the Ekaterinburg first summit, there was always this notion, oh, they're so different, there's nothing for them to talk about, they will demise next day, they're not thinking alike. And while Renata said, not quite clear about what we achieved 20 years later, we're still together. And as a person who's been following, not only following, but working within BRICS, I can tell you it's a really intense tissue of interaction and cooperation. And it's what is important. It's not just on the governmental level. It's not summits, just summits. It's not ministerial meetings. It's not just expert meetings. It's about youth talking to each other. It's about universities talking to each other, and actually Network University, Sarah mentioned it, Network University idea came from us, from the BTTC. We first discussed it actually in Durban when South Africa already came in. And it made to the leaders' declaration very fast, and we actually realized it. We still have a way to go to improve it, its functioning, but it's there. And it is important. It's about parliamentarians, civil society. We have since 2015 civil society dialogue, very sustainable, and those members, they continue talking to each other. Academic Forum and BTTC, it exists even from earlier times. Business Council. Now, as Honorable Mr. Desfonde said, we also have a BRICS business alliance, but business BRICS was there from 2013. So it's also sustainable. All layers of society in BRICS are talking. They have their own issues, and they have their own concrete ideas and projects that are being realized. And this cannot be taken away from BRICS. This is a success already in its own, because we have more and more issues to talk about. And I'll come back to the situation then. Yes, we started out as primarily economic entity, but yes, you said geopolitics come in, but at the same time, it's also about, it's a comprehensive mechanism which covers politics and governance, and that's why we're talking about how we upgrade multilateralism, how we honor it, what is their place of their United Nations. It's central for all the BRICS countries. But at the same time, we see that the UN reform is still being stalled. It's not moving anywhere. And BRICS in this regard, and that's your point about agenda takers, not agenda setters, we can act, and from last year, we saw Algeria, Iran, and Argentina officially applying to join BRICS. Dozens of countries actually expressed their interest as well. So this is actually a new, more and more recognized format, with the BRICS serving as a quote-unquote P5, which could offer those new non-confrontational ideas for multilateralism. This is important. And the third pillar for the BRICS, and it's been there also for quite some time, is its humanitarian track. And this is ensured by what I've been talking earlier about by their ability and interest of different society layers of BRICS work with each other. So it's a comprehensive mechanism. It survived, and it actually got stronger with all the turbulence and geopolitical conundrum that we're witnessing. And that's why we can say that it is a success, and it could and should contribute to global governance.
So let me follow up on that. You mentioned about the P5 in BRICS, right? Well, two of the BRICS are part of the UNSC P5. The other three have a desperate desire to get into the UN Security Council, but the first two don't wholeheartedly support the other three. So until we can ourselves agree that yes, at least the three others are equally deserving to be in the UN Security Council, how do you really, to me it seems like we are unable to walk the talk ourselves.
Well, that's a difficult issue, and it's always been difficult on the agenda. You would witness it from the official track. But if you look at the documents in their dynamics, it's interesting that BRICS documents were getting more and more deep and more involved into pronouncing that the other three BRICS members have to be entitled into joining their kind of a more decision-making capacity of their UNSC. But the point is that it's not the two members, Russia and China, that could decide it. This is a general decision which we cannot influence. We cannot tell them what to do. And that is why, exactly, why I say that having in mind the idea that BRICS is getting popularity and is being approached by other countries, and we're looking at the criteria now of how they should join, And my personal idea that, yes, we have to keep efficiency, but we also have to think that we're not exclusive. We are an inclusive format. That actually distinguishes us from many other formats that exist now on their international arena. And so with this format in enlarging and us being the core members, we could be influencing the agenda of really reforming multilateralism, including the United Nations. So here I would not quite agree that it's not wholehearted approach. If you look at the documents, it is getting deeper every time.
Okay. Suranjali, your thoughts, and also if I can be provocative, Renato mentioned something really interesting, and it also takes off from what Ninad said. China organized 170 meetings. South Africa is planning 190. Is that too many? Are we spreading it too thin? Shouldn't somebody say enough and start rolling back and focusing on core areas that we agreed upon rather than making it an umbrella under which everything fits?
Thank you. I think you raised a very valid point. Before I go into the comment on BRICS itself, I think it's important to have dialogues, but I think those dialogues have to be streamlined. And if we get lost in 190 meetings, you have documents which are as big and as non-committal as you see. But in terms of what we talk about BRICS as an economist, I have a little bit of skepticism, because if you put on your trade lens or you put on your investment lens, you see that these economies essentially compete with each other for the money that's floating worldwide, as well as to cater to markets in terms of goods and services. And so therefore, there is only as much cooperation that you can expect within BRICS. But having said that, I think what you're going to see over the next few years is that it could be a good way to resist some of the changes in the international order. What we're seeing after COVID-19 is that there is a great degree of skepticism in terms of how the international organizations have worked. So there are people questioning the Bretton Woods. And I think with a template such as the NDB, it gives you a potential for saying, hey, there's another model. We can sort of fund, but that requires scaling up. So I think BRICS need to figure out how to scale up the current level of finance, especially because if you look at developing countries, there is massive debt crisis. And we are seeing that IMF is stalled on the funding lines, and the critical requirement of funding is not there, even though countries are reaching out in panic. So I think that is one way that BRICS could reinvigorate itself as a platform for developing countries, where we're talking about the global south significantly. I think the other thing that will come around and unite the BRICS is EU's CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is going to be levied on all of these economies that are struggling to transition away. And especially, for China and India and South Africa, this is extremely significant because of the relevance of coal. And so therefore, talking about common strategies will sort of again help bring BRICS back to the center of the conversation. So I think stress can generate more cooperation. We've seen that after the war. We've seen that how Russia and China, Russia and India have developed ways of transacting with each other. So you have an alternative, to the payment mechanisms that already exist, which means that we can quickly scale up infrastructure if we do cooperate. We're also seeing use of different currencies. So there was at some point conversation about a BRICS currency, and again, that fell apart because we thought there was not enough in common between us. But I think with the sanctions or with changing patterns of trade, we could explore different types of currency arrangements, which I think is at the heart of international cooperation. So I think while I have my doubts on whether there are commonalities, I think stress can bring more cooperation, as I said before.
No, I think that's a wonderful point that, necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention. So maybe we are living in these times where the extraordinary circumstances will force us to do something substantive in responding to new challenges. Ms. Liu, let me turn to you. You did say that BRICS is not an area that you focused on, but climate is what you've devoted a lot of time on. Are there exemplars from China? You think China is doing enough in terms of its efforts to reduce emissions? And is it something that it can contribute in terms of the larger challenges of climate change that the world faces?
In terms of climate change, I think, so China brought up this dual carbon climate pledge in 2020, and that would potentially prevent 0.2 to 0.3 degree of further global warming, and India's NDC would add up to another 0.1 degree of prevention of further global warming. If that's not significant, I don't know what other climate pledges could be. But again, repeatedly, we also see China, India, and the BRICS altogether in climate negotiations being seen as the blocks that block the climate negotiation for more ambitious pledges. So it's really hard for me to tell whether there are successful stories within the BRICS in terms of enhancing the global decarbonization, or just really using that UNFCCC platform to bargaining for more space for the developing countries, as we were saying, to gain that rights to continue to develop while transitioning to a more decarbonized economic development patterns. There's something I really wanted to talk about, which is just a transition, and especially in the context of coal phase out. As most of the countries sitting here, we are dealing with, especially China, India, and South Africa, dealing with the extremely difficult and challenging coal phase out. We've seen initial innovations in financial mechanisms to support South Africa's coal transition, for example. We're seeing discussions in Indonesia about implementing that mechanism. But we're really looking at China. How do we transit China's coal-dependent economy? Till today, coal accounts for 50, if my number is still correct, 56% of China's total energy consumption. And China is the biggest coal consumer, consuming over half of the world's coal. A single province in China, called Shanxi, accounts for 1/6 of the global coal, produces coal globally. And how do we transit that province if that's not even as big or significant as the country of South Africa? And I think all these issues can be potentially collaborated among the BRICS. But again, in terms of BRICS as a bloc, I think there are still a lot of negotiations that should be done within them.
Thank you. Caleb, you were indicating that you want to bring a youth perspective to BRICS. What are your thoughts?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I think it's so important to have young people within these spaces. In South Africa, well, especially with Africa having such a young population, I think over 50% of its population are young people. Having them, in these dialogues is so important, because ultimately this is the world that they are going to inherit, right? And one thing that we do so well, especially in South Africa, is that we have these dialogues, these conferences with the young people, and we get them to engage with our ministers, our politicians. SAYA, the think tank that I'm representing today, has an annual youth conference where they bring together young people and they speak about all of the issues that South Africa are facing and also Africa as well. And what are we as young people going to do in order to bring our part? And when we do that, we present our document to our Department of International Relations, as well as sometimes to our presidency. And then they take those things and they take it further onto the global scale. And so I think one thing that really impressed me with the Raisina Dialogue was that they use the young fellows to ask these tough questions, and that's something that I think we can replicate, double or even triple over the next 3 years in the amount of effort we put into giving young people, the expertise and knowledge, and sometimes I think also we have this, for lack of a better word, delusion that maybe it's only young people who have these, degrees and experiences, whereas where I come from in South Africa, there's so many young people who can't even afford to go to college, right? But they bring so much more to the table, They sit at the exact same table as us and give their knowledge and experience because, it's great to have all these specialists in the house to bring their perspective, but it's also, there's nothing that can, outnumber lived experiences. So I think that's what young people bring to the table mostly, yeah.
Over the last 2 days at the Raisina, one of the themes that has come up recurrently is how India's ability to create digital public infrastructure has been such a game changer, promoting financial inclusion, women's empowerment, food security, all of in really getting us the ability to address some of the most pressing challenges that we faced in the last couple of years. Is that something that BRICS can take forward as we go along? Because I know South Africa has been looking at this with some interest. I don't know about the other countries. And not just within BRICS, but beyond?
Definitely yes. Why? Because we have within BRICS at least 2 of the countries that are very close to technological frontier, China and South Africa, and India, sorry, for that matter. And hence there are lessons to be learned. Having said that, let me, my presentation, my previous talk, I said I was doing a pinch of salt. Let me make it bitter and sweet. I'm not in disagreement with what Victoria said. The point is, because the group was created to influence global governance, and because we had 5 different and geographically apart countries, it was, and it is, and will be necessary for each country to know each other. And this is a long and slow and gradual process. I mean, all these 100+ meetings, the women groups, et cetera, it's a natural process. My point is, probably the whole thing is not right now as mature as was expected, as a group able to have proactive action in the international scenario in most items. In some items, definitely so. And hence, going back to your question, this look for complementarity and mutual knowledge comprises, and increasingly so, the adoption of artificial intelligence, the practical use of technology, and so on and so forth. So we have a lot to learn from each other. And this is part of this mutual process of knowing specific experiences and so on.
So before I turn over to the floor for a few questions, in 1 minute, if you had one priority for the next year, what would you say that should be for the Think Tanks Council? Victoria?
I cannot do just with one priority.
One, not 190.
But 190 is not just about official track, right? So it's just showing the comprehensive. Okay, that's a tough task. I would say we have to continue with their, I would say one for each of the pillars, politics, economics, and a humanitarian cooperation. So for politics, it should be what India was looking at and what actually South African priorities are about. We have to provide for continuity and actually finally have a say with multilateralism and the reform of global governance, how it should be in the interest of everybody, not just a few privileged. For economist side, I would say what you just mentioned about BRICS currency dying, it's a very kind of difficult process. It's very laborious, but I think this could come back because now there is great demand for actual going away from the dependence on their not always, let's say, reliable one currency or one country deciding for everybody. So I think this could be, and this is a general trend, not just with BRICS, but in a larger scale. And in humanitarian area, I would say we should go for, I'm part of the university, so I'd say, in a way, upholding and enhancing BRICS University to what we had initially in mind for it, right? So to have a more, to introduce a more harmonization of educational and science priorities, because we have STI, we have network at the university, but what we need is more harmonization of legal standards, of laws, and, for example, introducing BRICS mobility that could be equal to what Europeans have with Erasmus. So something like this could be worked out within BRICS. Just that.
Good. So we have one from each pillar. Surajli?
Yes, I think one of the greatest challenges that confront us is the climate challenge. And I think over the last 1 year, we've seen pressures to sign bilateral deals wherein you scale up finance. So I would reiterate that the NDB perhaps can assume the leadership role in making this transition possible, scaling up finance, and not just scaling up finance in these BRICS countries, but also countries that are codependent on them for trade and are small and developing.
Rada?
Your question is what suggestions for the BTTC? If I were in the shoes of the coordinator of the BTTC right now, my personal involvement with the BTTC was 8 years ago. And by then, we prepared a whole book of suggestions. My suggestion would be to revisit and update that exercise, because there we had a number of propositions. It's about time to go back and see what remains from those suggestions and just update them.
Okay, Victoria, you want to say something on that?
One sentence. We introduced in 2020, with regards to what we did with BTTC, the monitoring indicators. I think this is something we should also go along with. The priority pillars and monitoring by us, not by outside visitors. So I think we should go along with that.
Caleb, will you pass that on to Sarah? Any, along with any other thoughts?
Just a final thought, I think one of the important things, like I mentioned, young people, but also I think from South Africans' perspective, is to further the BRICS Africa partnership. I think that has always been South Africa's main pillar, was to also represent the views and knowledge of other African countries who are often so left out at these dialogues. So I think it's very important for South Africa to continue that, especially since the first BRICS summit that they held in Durban was focused on BRICS and Africa. So I think that's something that they should continue. Yeah.
Ms. Liu?
It's more like a question for the panelists that we can continue discussing probably later. I can't get my head around that this is probably the only peaceful panel in which China and India are not competing to each other, in which Ukraine war is not mentioned, in which reassuring, what is called friend shoring is not mentioned. But let's be honest, China is decarbonizing. China wants to decarbonize. China is also manufacturing the clean technologies for the rest of the world. India wants to get a spoon from the soup. South Africa and Brazil as well. How can we work together as a bloc, but also as an individual country to take its own responsibilities in this climate negotiations and actions? Blocking China wouldn't be the best scenario for anyone, because even if countries outside can find alternative supply chains here and there, China needs to decarbonize. China needs the world technologies, hydrogen, CCUS, a lot of technologies to decarbonize. And that is the big question that I have in this geopolitical landscape that we sit in.
Fair point. Let me open it up to the floor.
I was just reflecting on the whole panel and trying to figure out if should we adjust our expectations and perhaps acknowledge our limitations. Should we just start to talk about BRICS as the biggest forum as Global South we have for international cooperation, for economic cooperation, but not as a global governance forum. So treat it as it is. I mean, if this was a peaceful panel, maybe it's just because we are not going that direction, just to make a link with your question. And so thank you very much.
Anyone wants to take that on? You want to direct it to anyone in particular?
Maybe Ms. Baumann, which is kind of starting this reflection.
As far as the peace or warring concerns, it's for for India and China to comment on that, because we Brazilians are far away from that, and I wouldn't say a word about those bilateral conflicts or China, Russia, or whatever. So, yes, most of the achievements in economic terms, trade and investment in BRICS are bilateral relationship, and that's a syndrome. And that's an example of how far we are from joint action for the BRICS as a group in terms of trade promotion, trade measures. That's something very complicated. It has never been discussed apart from trade facilitation, bureaucratic issues, not trade facilitation as opening up our 5 economies to each other. Investment is still very much bilateral terms. And hence, from the viewpoint of we economists tend to think that the economy is the base for everything. So politics comes after the economic issues. So if the economic side is not as deeply rooted within the group as a group, but only on a bilateral mood, it's very difficult to think in terms of the group as one homogeneous agent to influence global governance, which is the point I stressed from the very beginning. It's a building process. Maybe we should not expect from the group more than it can deliver at this stage.
So what you're really saying, and that's what I hear from there as well, that accept the realities that exist and lower your level of ambition rather than keep growing it. Is that it? Victoria.
Well, sometimes if you don't watch it closely enough, you might not really witness a number of things. Just 2 examples to show that we are not actually striking too much above expectations. 2 instances. BRICS, they are all over the world, right? It's quite difficult to see that those are the countries that would be naturally complementary to each other and having huge trade turnovers. Meanwhile, over the past 15 years being together, what happened is that their trade turnover grew more than 1,000 times. 1,000 times. So, and while with the rest of the world, it was like 300%, 1,000 to 300%. So it's a figure, right? So yes, from small numbers, but it continues to grow, and they're finding for a new ways and modes to cooperate. So we already have the second BRICS economic partnership adopted, and it's working. And number two, the example, the NDB, which was already mentioned. We had this idea within BTTC, and it came into existence just 2 years after the first idea was circulated. Not a single other grouping with the very like-minded countries, very close economic terms like to each other, like the G7, ever did this really huge advance. This has to be kept in mind.
A round of applause for that. Ambassador Deshpande.
Actually, just two comments. As we are discussing whether we are spreading too thin and we are multiplying with the meetings and areas where we should focus. I will echo what Ms. Liu mentioned about climate. That just last year, and credit goes to China, that China organized the first ever ministerial level meeting of on climate. Now, this is to be noted that the basic countries, that is Brazil, South Africa, India and China, are in climate change negotiations together for years. And now Russia also joining at ministerial level. So the basic grouping which was discussing climate now got Russia also when we have a BRICS meeting at ministerial level. So that shows that we are gradually progressing and bringing our stances together. Having said that, I think there needs to be much more progress on what our dear moderator mentioned about the Security Council aspirations. I think the BRICS countries can do a little bit more in terms of stating and supporting each other towards the Security Council aspirations. So what I will say that, well, the BRICS is a dynamic grouping. We are bringing lot more areas together and also increasing the level of togetherness. At the same time, there are areas where we need to do a little bit more than what we are doing right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, moderator, for the panelists also today. Just one question, and I heard very nice words like Erasmus. I am a head of Erasmus here in India. I am an official of the European Union in charge of research and education. So you mentioned also one of the last words was G7. How you compare notes, how you compare your club of the five. Yesterday, Minister Ayashi from Japan was saying they are the Beatles in the Quad. So I'm not asking you to compare you to the Quad, but how you compare yourself to the G7, and how do you exchange notes? How, maybe as Renato was claiming, if you have not done it yet, how will you do it?
I just had a question, moving away from the geopolitics question. The BRICS was coined in 2001 by Goldman Sachs. The world has changed quite a lot since then. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on whether we should expand the BRICS grouping, get more countries that, like Indonesia or Nigeria, which have actually grown their trade relations with the BRICS grouping by more than 1,000x, actually, since 2001. Would love to know what the panel's thoughts are on that question.
I have 2 points, basically. I have been hearing that BRICS has been, trying to lower its expectations and limiting itself to the economic issues. I understand and I appreciate that. But then, we are talking so much of climate change. And there was also a reference made by the audience here, participants. I think now it is time that BRICS also thinks in terms of one, creating a fund for what is required for climate change for the global south. Second is, when we talk of climate change, it is not just the finance, it is also the lifestyles for environment, which we need to adopt so that we bring down the global warming as per the targets. So, and on these two things, I think there is a lot needs to be done within the BRICS group. Second is, just another point. When we say BRICS should be or is the voice of the global south, can it restrict its expectations only to the economic issues? This is my broader question.
Suranjali, you want to take a shot at that? And quick, because I'm almost out of time.
I'll be super fast. I see a connect between the two questions to say that you can expand the membership. You can also have a dialogue between G7 and what you're seeing even in the G20 play out, but all you need is a common denominator. There has to be a common minimum that is an expectation of everybody to talk. In terms of climate finance, as I said specifically earlier, that the NDB can play a great role because in every G20 communique, we're also asking the question of how MDBs will do better and do we need to find alternative sources of finance. It's just that we have to agree between the countries on what the contribution needs to be, who's going to give how much to this process and how we're going to scale that up further. So those are my quick comments.
Okay, Victoria?
Well, comparing G7 and BRICS, we heard from Goldman Sachs also said that we actually would be bigger than G7 in 2032. We already are bigger than that, so if we compare by figures. But in terms of cooperation, and it's great to hear that you're for Erasmus, I think we have to be mutually, complementary. And while there's a turbulent time at the moment, I think we have some ideas to share, and probably it would be good to have more dialogue between the G7 and BRICS because we're not against it. But with regards to expansion, I believe it's a good idea. Of course, we have to look at their criteria, not because we have lots of agreements already in place. We have to see how to integrate those countries. Countries you mentioned have not officially applied, from what I know. But of course, it's a good idea, as well as for one of the Western countries to join at some point, the BRICSEP. That's not my term, BRICS Economic Partnership. I stole it. But actually, this could be a good idea.
Okay. Any last word from anyone else? Yes, please.
The climate issue has been mentioned time and again. I think there are some issues that go well beyond BRICS, well beyond G7. These are topics that everybody has to be concerned with, independently of the group where you belong. I mean, these are challenging issues that are putting our lives in risk. Having said that, the other issue about enlarging the group, the argument in favor of that is to reduce the China plus 4 that is often mentioned. BRICS are China plus 4. And if you enlarge that, you will reduce the relative weight of China. But then, because we are in this process of knowing each other, increasing our bilateral knowledge, I don't see why we should enlarge the group right now, because this is still a work in progress. If you do that, you increase the number of people, you increase the difficulty of reaching consensus, and everything becomes even more blurred than what it is right now. So the Brazilian position, the official Brazilian position, has always been very foot-dragger in that sense.
Okay, I'm told we are out of time. Thank you very much. And hopefully the conversations will continue over the course of the year, over the 190 meetings. Thank you.